Hi, my name is Kaylee Fisher. Today we will be heading to the Kentucky Gateway Museum to check out their new aviation exhibit.
Hi, I'm Tandy Nash, the Education Curator at the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center. And in our changing gallery in the Wormald, we have the history of aviation and space. And it started out as far back as the Chinese dynasty, 850 before BC. And they used kites for flight. People would look to the sky and try to master the forces that would get you into the air. And the Chinese used kites to, move people across rivers. They used them to put ropes across rivers so that they could start building bridges or walkways. And people even tied themselves to kites and tried to fly. So, it was a big quest to get into the air. And there was a monk in 1010 who decided that he was going to use a kite, except for he was going to glide down. He went to the top of the cathedral and he jumped off with the kite. Well, he hit the ground, he broke both of his legs, and he decided that it would have worked had he used a tail on his kite, but the Pope told him no more jumping off cathedrals, so that kind of shut that down. Other people tried to get into the air through other devices. Didn't always work. Some of them might have gotten you off the ground for a little bit, not very high, not very far. The Montgolfier brothers from France were paper makers, and they designed the very first hot air balloon. And first they sent up animals to test that out, and then they went up in the air balloon in 1783. And from the hot air balloon, another Frenchman began experiments with parachutes. And he went up in the air balloon and then dropped from a parachute. And then a year later, his wife did it. So still trying to get up in the air and manipulate flight. George Calais was from England, and he designed gliders. Otto Lilienthal was also designing gliders in 19th century, and he even built a hill to jump off of to test his gliders, which was kind of neat. Now, you can look at this area and you will see that Leonardo da Vinci, he designed so many things. He must have been the smartest man in the world at that time, because he designed tanks, he designed a lot of the things that we use now, but he never tested them. And this was his helicopter aerial screw. And then of course now we have helicopters that will fly laterally, and we have helicopters that will fly horizontally and laterally. And a lot of them are used for military and everything. We also use helicopters for at hospitals to transport people that have been in serious accidents. But again, it all started with birds. They looked at the wings of the birds and decided that different flying mechanisms needed to have wings, and that's what brought you to the gliders first. And it was 1903, the Wright Flyer was the very first plane, it was a biplane, to go into the air. Of course, it was Wilbur and Orville Wright, and they were bicycle makers. At the very same time, in Carter County, Kentucky, you had Matthew Sellers testing flight. And even though he didn't beat the Wright brothers flying, even though he was flying, he did patent landing gear. So Kentucky can say that they've got somebody, and of course you guys are the birthplace of flight, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Curtiss. In all my time studying aviation, I never heard about Curtiss, but these are all of the accomplishments that Glenn Curtiss did. He was into motorcycles, and he started a lot of patents with motorcycle engines and then developed engines for airplanes. And he was the very first one to have a pilot's license. He, designed a pilot's license. He developed the first flying boat, or a plane that could land on the water or fly through the water. Airmail, once we went up, we utilized it for many things. And before, airmail was done by homing pigeons. And these are some letters and dispatches for the homing pigeons. They would tie them around their neck or tie little letters around their ankles, and they would, let them go, and they would go home. That's why they were called homing pigeons. So that one is to the Queen of England. But not to be outdone, they decided that they were going to send airmail. And the first one was done in India. This is the cover of the first airmail sent through India. But the United States decided in 1918 that they were going to send Earl Ovington up. And then, of course, Bessie Coleman was the first woman that held a pilot's license, and she was African American and Native American descent, and which was, that didn't happen. Her brothers were in World War I, and of course they were in a segregated unit at that time. And when they came back, they talked about how the French women had so many more things that they could do that women in the United States couldn't do. And they said some of them even fly. Well, she decided she was going to fly. So they wouldn't teach her in the United States, so she had to go to France to take her pilot's license, to get her pilot's license. But she came back to the United States, and she started putting on air shows where she would do barrel rolls, and she would fall from the sky and then all of a sudden start her plane up. But she had a training school as well. Everybody knows Charles Lindbergh, not just because he was the first person to fly across the Atlantic, but tragically one of his children was kidnapped, and they found him years later, but he'd been killed. So anyway, Zeppelins at the time. Anyway, these are other people first in flight. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly solo nonstop transatlantic, and she also started the 99s, which is a group of 99 women that were navigators or in aviation, started a club so that they could fight for the women's rights in the air, because the men at that time were so chauvinistic or biased that if they knew a woman was going up, they'd mess with her plane. Well, that could kill a person. So anyway, they started a group so that they could fight for more rights. Jean Gardner Batten, she's from New Zealand, and I like her just because she was such a character. She was wealthy, but she would get engaged to somebody and he would buy her a plane. And then when his money ran out, she'd break up with him and become engaged to another person, and they'd buy her a plane. So she always had a plane. First radio control airplane was 1938, and you'll see one of the first helicopters here, 1939. It was the first practical helicopter, and it took flight in Connecticut. This is a miniature. It's in, I think, 1/24 scale, not the 1/12 scale that you usually see over in the miniatures, but it is in commemoration of the lady who collects our miniatures. She got her pilot's license when she was 18, and this is the field and the plane, copies of the things she remembers when she got her pilot's license. This is a field of tobacco, and you can see a crop duster coming over. So planes were starting to be utilized not just as transportation, but they had some functionality. And then we started out with the jet engines, and it was Charles Yeager who exceeded the speed of sound in his test flights. So everything started to be a little bit more advanced, faster, go farther, go higher. These are local pictures that you'll see of the airports that we had around here. And don't know whether you all know it because you're so young, but Aberdeen had a airport right across from the Dairy Queen, you know, that big grass strip. That was the Aberdeen airport, and you'll see pictures of biplanes that came through this area and local people. This is an airplane ride at the Germantown Fair, and you all are too young to remember who Uncle Al is, but he was like Captain Kangaroo. He was a child star, and he flew in for Clyde Barber's activities. A Aberdeen boy was a young pilot to get his wings, and he was the youngest pilot in, I believe, in Mason County. He flew in Mason County because Aberdeen didn't have their strip anymore. But that's Pruitt Chamness, and he went to Ripley High School, I believe. These moved on to supersonic airliners with the Concorde and the Tupolev. Boeing 747 was the big commercial transports. Boeing also transported the Shuttle back and forth, but it wasn't until 1970, you all were probably just a glimmer in your parents' eye, that they started stewardesses. And stewardesses had a certain weight requirement and height requirement, and they, you know, when you get on a plane now, you have stewardesses and stewards that help you, but they did not have that until the 70s. But this is a stewardess's outfit, another stewardess outfit. Mr. Humphreys is a pilot, and he loaned us his flight command suit. And then you've got a lady who works here in the museum. She was a flight attendant when she was younger. Rockets, again, the Chinese were the first to develop rockets. And if anybody has seen the movie Mulan, you saw the rockets that they sent to hit the avalanche. So they used the first rockets as weapons. They were also used as fireworks. And there was a man in China who decided that he was going to attach rockets to a chair, and he was going to take flight with those rockets. So he had his little guy light all the rockets at the same, you know, to take off at the same time, and it blew up, and they never found the guy, and it kind of ended the man's desire to use rockets as a means of travel for quite a long time. Monks, there was a monk named Roger Bacon who was working with gunpowder, and he was testing to see certain amounts, certain kinds of gunpowder, how they would change the range. This man was the one who decided that it was tubes. If you put your, in certain size tubes, how far things would go. And then they even started doing the step rocket like they use now. You know how even the shuttle will drop different fuel tanks at different times. So your lower would send off, and then it would fall off when your fuel was used, and then your second stage would light up and move on. Even before we even thought about making it to the moon, Jules Verne was a sci-fi writer, and he was back in the 1800s, in the 19th century, and he wrote about going to the moon. So there was always that constant pull of getting up and farther beyond. The concrete rocket used the concept of using the different stages and the tubes, and they used those rockets, of course, for military use. And those are the rockets that Francis Scott Key talked about, the rocket's red glare, to write our national anthem. This is a copy of the first daguerreotype of the moon, a picture of the moon done on a camera. And he is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, was a Russian scientist, and he's considered one of the 3 great men in the history of rocketry. But he said the Earth's the cradle of humanity, but mankind cannot stay in the cradle forever. And he didn't get to see the rockets go. I mean, he was that early in time, but he was a forerunner in making rockets go up into the air, because the whole process was finding a vehicle that was light enough and strong enough to get out of the atmosphere. So the second father of rocketry, I would consider Robert Goddard. And Robert Goddard would be at the Redstone Arsenal in the 1920s, and he would test different kinds of rockets. And in the 60s, was it in the 60s? Right after World War II. So it would have been in the 40s and 50s. We had kidnapped, I guess you would say, V2 missiles from the Germans that hadn't exploded. You know, they would bomb someplace and they would collect it and it hadn't exploded. And so they started studying the German technology of their rockets, and eventually, getting ready towards the end of the war, the Germans were so low on people that they would pull scientists and machinery people that they had put in service, you know, back into working on rocket scientists. So the U.S. snuck out a group of German scientists from across the borders, and then they got them to the United States, and they called it Operation Paperclip. And one of those men who would eventually be the head of Operation Paperclip was Werner von Braun. And he is the man responsible. If you go to the Huntsville Space and Rocket Center, he brought these people to Huntsville, and they started out with the V2 rocket, and he was the man responsible for getting the United States to the moon, basically. And he had people behind him. Sputnik 1957 was the first unmanned satellite to go in. Of course, that was Russia. And so they started the big space race. You know, United States always has to be first. So after Sputnik, they started testing, and they tested with animals. The Russians had a pound puppy named Lakia, and they sent him up. Well, the only thing is, poor little Lakia was on a death mission because they planned on him going up. They just didn't plan on what was going to happen when he came down. So he, of course, died on impact when he hit the ground. We sent monkeys up. And 2 of the monkeys we sent up were Abel and Baker. And Miss Baker she lived a good long life. She lived at Huntsville, Alabama. You could see her and everything. And she's buried there. And her husband, George, is also buried there. And people take bananas and place them on our tombstones. But squirrel monkeys were usually the animals. And they've sent everything from mice to bees and all different kinds of animals in space. These are items we have on loan from Langley Flight Center. Once we sent the animals up and knew that they would be safe, we started to send astronauts. And this is the undergarment that they would wear on their EVAs that when they went outside of the capsule into zero-G gravity, there are extreme temperatures in space. So you can see the tubes inside that would send water that would cool the body, and it would also have tubes that would take the gases. When you breathe out carbon dioxide, it would absorb those gases so that you didn't continually poison yourself while you were breathing bad air. And it would also heat. If you were in extreme cold at the time, it would send warm water through. So you can see the EVA gloves with the little fingers, a boot to go inside with the items, some moon rocks. So the United States, once they sent the animals up and determined that it was safe, they decided that they were going to train a group of men. Most of them were fighter pilots or test pilots, and they were called the Mercury 7. And Alan Shepard was the first person from the United States to go up into space. However, he was beat by Yuri Gagarin, who was a Russian, who went up. And then John Glenn went up in Friendship 7. Valentina Tereshkova was the first Russian woman to go up, and we didn't have one until 1983 with Sally Ride. Another, Leninov, was a Soviet cosmonaut, and he circled in space, and he was the first to make a rendezvous, and astronaut Ed White was the American. Same time, just not fast enough. Of course, everybody knows that Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. He went with Buzz Aldrin. This is Buzz Aldrin, and we always see that picture and you think it's Neil Armstrong. But Neil took it of Buzz. So they were the first two men. He was the first man to step off. And other first, John Glenn, you know, he was in 1962, he orbited the Earth, and in 1998, he got to go up again. So he's the only astronaut that has been able to have first, because he was the first geriatric, first old astronaut, and they sent him up to do tests to see how the environment would affect an older person. And Gilliam Bluford was the first black man in space. Every time you went up, you had a different patch. And the patches were designed to have something special with the flights. 40 years ago, still before you all were born, they started with the Space Shuttle. And it was a glider. Space Shuttle is basically a glider. And it was used to take up a lot of different payloads. And it was responsible for building the International Space Station and everything. President Nixon's era was the one that introduced the Space Shuttle era. And during that time, when I first started teaching, they decided that they were going to send a teacher to space. And of course, each patch is special. Krista McCullough, they had a little apple on the patch to say that she was a teacher, and many of us applied to be the first teacher in space. We all wanted to go. And they chose Krista McCullough, who was very, very knowledgeable and was a good candidate. And the rest of us, poor folk, we became teachers in space, mentors here on Earth. But it was really neat. You know how you FaceTime and Snapchat and do all of that stuff? There wasn't any of that. And we were allowed to teach in our classrooms and watch them in the space shuttle. And Krista was going to teach certain lessons, and we were going to work alongside her on Earth while she taught them in space, so that the kids could see how the environment worked differently. Well, we were all excited. She was going up, and right after they flew off, the space shuttle exploded, killing all of the men and women that were on board. Ellison Onizuka was big into 4-H. The Blue Skies Below My Feet project, he did, and he was killed. Judy Resnick was killed. It was just tragic. There, of course, we kind of stole John Glenn. You all had John Glenn, and I think you all had Alan Shepard too, isn't he from Ohio? Okay, so you had two of the Mercury 7. We have, David Scott was a descendant of John May, who Maysville was named for. He was an astronaut, and then Story Musgrave is an astronaut, and even though he grew up not in Kentucky, he moved to Louisville, and he considers Kentucky his home, and he was the one responsible for going up in the shuttle and fixing the Hubble telescope, because the Hubble wasn't focusing correct, and he would practice on the end of an arm, you know, an arm that would come out from the shuttle, and he would practice that here in Huntsville, Alabama, so that when he got up there, he was able to work on it. And that's him on the arm. These are foods from NASA. Started out with the Mercury program with toothpaste tubes, and they'd roll them up. So you could get your beef, vegetables and beef out of a toothpaste tube. Not real appetizing. So through the program, they advanced a lot of things that we use here on Earth, promoted the development of certain things. You know how you have your squeezy boxes and yogurt items where they just got the twist top, and you've got where you can squeeze the container. Those things were developed. And then some of the things that you see can be vacuum packed just like they are, like nuts and candies and stuff. Coca-Cola was the first drink, soft drink in space. And nowadays, you know, where before they would have to figure out the diet and everything, the astronauts can pretty much plan what they want. And because in the International Space Station, the American food items don't fit in the galley that the Russians have, so they have their own little warmers and places to put their packages. So it's pretty neat how they've come. And the sad part about it is the United States, NASA isn't sending anybody up from here. We have to go on a Soyuz Russian rocket to get up in space now. However, there are a lot of private companies, very rich men who are trying to go to space now. So that's probably our frontier. But smartphone cameras, they're a space spinoff because they needed a camera small enough to take pictures. Diapers, Pampers. Neil Armstrong was getting ready to go in space. They kept holding him back. Well, they'd not figured out a way for him to go to the bathroom. So he literally wet himself. And so after that point, they put disposable diapers on the astronauts so that they could relieve themselves in space. And everybody's seen Hidden Figures. Katherine Johnson. John Glenn said he would not go up unless she figured out the numbers. And if she said it was okay, then he'd go up. So there are a lot of people, you don't have to be an astronaut to be in the space program. A lot of mathematicians, a lot of people just like you and me that work at Langley at the Jet Propulsion Center. JPL, I worked for JPL as a solar system educator for Kentucky. So if anybody needed any space education in their classes, they would call me and I would travel around and teach about the space. Allies divided up the territory that they won when they beat Germany. And Berlin, which happened to be the capital, was divided up between all of the allies, which would be French, English, United States, and they and Berlin got the other half. Well, Berlin didn't like, or the Russians didn't like the way that we were going to restructure things afterwards. So all of a sudden they blocked off the railways, the waterways, and the roads, so nobody could get in to the Allied areas. West Germany and East Germany were blocked, which became the future site of the Berlin Wall. That's when they built it. Well, we had all of these people inside Berlin that because of that blockage, weren't able to get food or fuel or anything like that. So we decided that we were going to fly in to the airport that was in Berlin and drop off food and fuel and everything like that. And these are the air carriers that brought that in. Well, there was a man, Gail Halverson, who was a pilot, and on his day off, he decided he was going to go watch the planes come in and unload and everything. And he noticed that there was a group of kids that were sitting across barbed wire fence in this little graveyard area. And he said they were too proud to beg. Usually when you go to another country, the kids are always asking for something, candy, chewing gum, anything, you know. And these kids weren't begging. And he reached in his pocket and he realized he only had 2 pieces of gum. And he said, if y'all don't fight over this, I'll bring more candy next time. I'll drop it off in the plane. And he gave him the 2 pieces of candy, and they divided the spearmint gum into pieces and shared with the people around them. And even the kids that didn't get the gum, they took the wrappers and they tore the wrappers up so that the kids could at least smell it. And it was the first time a lot of those kids, you know, had ever seen gum. In fact, one lady said that she swallows her gum to this day because it seemed like such a waste to spit it out. But he went back and he decided that he was going to save all of his candy rations and drop them out of his plane. And he would wiggle his wings. The kids said, how are we going to know it's you? And he said, I'll wiggle my wings. So they called him Captain Wiggle Wings. And he would drop his chocolates off. Well, it was such a hit that all the kids were running and trying to get some that his other buddies would wrap them up and put their rations out. And you can see the little parachutes over here that they're coming out. The kids all waiting for it and everything. Well, there was one little boy named Peter Zimmerman that wrote him a letter, said that he was 9 years old, but his legs weren't as long as other 9-year-old kids, and he couldn't get to the candy fast enough. So he wanted Gail to send him, gave him his address, or actually he wanted him to drop it over where he lived. And he said, you know, I live down this area, bombed out house, you know, drop it here. And Gail tried several times and just couldn't get it. So he gets a letter from Peter Zimmerman that said, you know, you're a pilot. You know how to read a map. How'd you guys win the war anyway? You know, so Gail sent him in the mail a package of candy, and they remain friends to this day. And another little girl, her chickens in the house, she didn't think that they laid eggs because it scared the planes. So she asked if he might send her some candy, and he did. And then years later, he was reassigned to Berlin, and he was invited by a Berlin couple to come and have dinner. And when they got there, she went to her china cabinet and she brought the letter back that she had received from him, and made such an impact, she wrote a book about it. But the Chocolate Pilot, Candy Bomber, Uncle Wiggly Wings. He had several names and got many, many letters from kids. And still, even after the Berlin airlift, he flew to Bosnia and dropped off, Sarajevo, different places where kids are in war-torn countries, and he's dropped them off. And he's still living. I think he's like 98.
Wow.
Yeah. But what a great humanitarian. All right, now come this way.